Hey everyone, and welcome to the Meeting Protocol Monthly podcast, where we chat with some of the absolute coolest people in the biz and bring you useful and relevant information about what's happening in the world of meeting planning. I'm Dora Figueredo, the head of events and education at Meeting Protocol, coming at you from New Jersey. At the core of an event professional's role is finding a way to change our attendees' behavior, whether that's shifting behavior to use a product, work differently, expand their networks, or something else. We all start our planning process from what outcome do we need from our audience? Today's episode is going to explore how to create really strong experiences to create this meaningful change and spark deep connections with our audience. And with that, I am so excited to welcome one of my favorite people in the world, this month's guests, Laurelin Whitfield, a professional certified coach and the co-author of the Art of Coaching workbook. While perhaps not a traditional event planner, Laurelin designs and facilitates professional learning for coaches, teachers, and leaders at all levels. And I have been lucky enough to work the logistics for events that she has planned. So I am so excited to showcase her expertise here today. So thank you so much for joining us. Tell us where you're joining from today and the quick background of how you became a coach who specializes in professional learning facilitation.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Dora. I am joining you today from Haarlem, not the Haarlem that's close to you in New Jersey, but the original Haarlem in the Netherlands where I live. And gosh, let's see. Well, I got my start as a classroom teacher who later moved into coaching. And I often say I spent my first decade as a teacher, my second decade as a coach, and now I'm like a teacher coach. And that shows up in a lot of different forms, sometimes one-on-one, and I'll talk a bit about that today, but also a lot of group facilitation and learning design. So excited to dig into that with you today.
Great. All right, so let's just jump in. With your coaching business, Mind the Heart, you help your clients explore how they can create meaningful change in their communities and personal lives. I often hear event managers say that they stay with their jobs because they love seeing a spark in their attendees' eyes, and they want their attendees to leave an event better than when they arrived. So creating meaningful changes in their attendee community. Tell me about a memorable event that you've been a part of recently. What made it exceptional? What can you tell was done with a lot of care in the planning process, etc.?
I had a lot of fun thinking about this question, Dora, and reliving some of the events that I participated in recent years. And one that came to mind is actually an event that you had a big hand in. It was Teach for All's global conference in Nepal in 2018. And I think that there are a few things that I would highlight about this. I mean, one, we were in an incredibly inspirational setting. Kathmandu is beautiful and deeply historic. And I really appreciated that we connected with that setting where we were. So it wasn't just in the background, but it was actually very much in the foreground, from the little things about the color scheme of the conference and the kind of rituals that we had as we were coming into some of the different conference spaces to getting out into the community and doing some visits. That sense of place, I think, is so important in an event and so deeply human to want to connect with where we are. We also had a really clear purpose in why we were coming together that kind of had equal parts celebration and learning. That, I think, is a polarity that we always have to manage in events, especially ones that have a strong learning orientation, is how do we also bring in a celebration and an acknowledgement of what has already been learned, what's already there. Obviously, really interesting and diverse group of attendees, which was great. I got an opportunity to be involved, which of course made it more meaningful for me because I got to co-lead a session. And then finally, this kind of sense of possibility and celebration and joy, and I might even say play, that pervaded the entire event. I just left feeling good. And of course, all of this was made possible by tons of careful attention to the participant experience. So there were clear directions, there was lots of signage, the schedule was really spacious, and there were snacks everywhere. So great event.
Yeah, food is really, I think I have been to like a lot of weddings where I don't remember the wedding, but I remember whether the food was good or bad.
So true.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that there's so many times where I go to an event and I'm super pumped about the location. Like I'm going to IMEX in Las Vegas, which is an event planners conference in Las Vegas this October. And like, I mean, I'm not like the biggest Las Vegas fan. It's not exactly my type of place, but it's still very cool to be like, hey, I'm going to Vegas, or I'm going to this very cool place. I'm going to Nepal.
Mm,
And then you only see the inside of a conference center.
yeah, it's the worst.
It's so sad. You've gone all that way. You know absolutely nothing about the place you're in, nothing about the culture. You haven't experienced anything. So yeah, I agree. It is just as important to bring the community into that experience as it is to like have an experience in a cool place.
Yeah, so true.
Mhm. So experience design is an approach to creating experiences that solve a problem or generate emotional responses and or behavioral changes from the attendee, which I think aligns really well with your coaching experience. What is your approach to strong experience design, and where do you begin when you work with clients?
Yeah, there's so many ways that I think we could come at this question. But I think to begin with, it's just so important to recognize the conditions that facilitate change. There are a lot of great change management frameworks out there, but one of the ones that I find most accessible comes from the book Switch by Dan and Chip Heath. I think it was published 15 years ago or so now. But I think that they just laid out so beautifully the three major conditions that enable change to happen. So they have this whole metaphor of the rider and the elephant, and so they talk about first you have to motivate the elephant, right? So in any sort of rider elephant situation, at the end of the day, the elephant is the 2,000-pound animal and the rider is the 150-pound human, and so it begins with motivating the elephant. And this part of the metaphor really stands in for motivation. So begin with the why. Why should people care about this problem that they're coming to address, this behavior that you're asking them to take on? What is it going to mean for them personally to make a change? And then, of course, the writer needs direction. So what exactly is the problem that you're trying to solve for, the change that you're seeking? What's the behavior or response that you're looking for, and getting really clear on that? And then finally, you have to clear the path. So for the elephant and the rider to move forward. And this piece of the metaphor has to do with looking for friction in the system and trying to reduce it, which is why I really love ops people. So I was trying to think of a good example of this. And I'm going to pull from my coaching work here, but I think this is evident at lots and lots of layers of events, from one-on-one conversations all the way up to huge, many thousand people events. So a lot of my coaching clients come to me because they're gearing up to make some kind of big change in their lives. Maybe they're becoming parents for the first time, or they just got a big promotion. They're stepping into leadership at a much higher level, or they're changing jobs, or they're going out on their own. And so a lot of times we start by getting really clear on why this change matters, because that motivation is going to be really important to sustain them through the long haul, because change is hard. And we have lots of things psychologically that hardwire us against wanting to change. So tapping into that intrinsic motivation is really key in the process. And then we also have to direct the writers. So this can take a couple of different forms. Sometimes if the nature of the change is really obvious, then we want to visualize it as clearly as we can. What is the future that they're trying to create? Sometimes the change isn't as obvious. And so what we want to do instead is connect more with what are the values, the kind of the internal guideposts that you want to use as this future is emerging. And then finally, to clear the path, we had designed practices that are going to support them along the way. So sometimes this is mindfulness. More recently, I was working with a client whose practice ended up being, how do I get comfortable with the physical sensation of uncertainty? Like, I'm so uncomfortable not knowing what's going to happen and what's next for me. Like, how do I just be with that knot in my stomach and that contraction in my chest? And so how can we design practices that help people take baby steps toward the future that they're trying to create?
I love that. That's amazing. I think so many times that especially newbie event professionals, they get very caught up in the wow factor of an event, especially because that's what you see on social media, right? Like the really
Oh
big,
yeah, of
big
course.
Instagrammable things, but that's not the why of the event. And so
Yeah.
I think this is so good. So such important things to highlight. Can you give an example of how you've applied these ideas in an event that you've contributed to?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, first off, I love planning events. I don't think I've done any quite on the scope that you have, but I really love thinking through really multifaceted experiences for people. And I was really taken by a book that I'm sure a lot of your listeners have read, The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. And she makes a really compelling case that people are meant to come together. We are social creatures by nature. Perhaps now more than ever, we need to be coming together. So, as I was thinking about some of the experiences that I've had to hand in, I was remembering, for example, this really incredible week that I got to spend in the Yucatan jungle of Mexico with leaders from around the world. And I could certainly talk to that. Might not be quite as relevant to everybody who's listening to this podcast. So I thought I'd actually share about a conference that I contributed to that was in a hotel conference room in Indianapolis, because it doesn't get more mainstream than that. And I mention this because I got a lot of feedback from participants at this conference that it was some of the best professional development that they've received. And we actually saw a lot of changes in people's choices and behaviors afterward, which of course is, what we would want to see coming out of a conference. So the change in this case that we were seeking is that we were trying to help an organization have a stronger, more liberatory learning orientation. And this involved certainly some structural changes, but it also involved a whole lot of deep inner shifts to make this happen. A lot of re-examination of how do we use our time and how do we make decisions as an organization and how much do we actually value and put our energy behind this, saying that we think professional development is important. How much do we put our money where our mouth is? So the format of the piece that I had a hand in was a 6-hour workshop over 2 days in the context of this broader conference that was underway. And I'll highlight just, I think, a few of the moves that I think connect with how the Heath brothers describe change in that book, Switch. So we started with the why. So the setup of the 6 hours to motivate the elephants inside of all of us. We started with a gallery walk of quotes from people within that organization around how they had experienced the culture of learning there. And some of the quotes were positive, and some of the quotes really highlighted the pain points, the lived experience of people in that organization. And we left lots of open space as people were walking around and reading these quotes for people to read and think and digest and partner up with people. They'd fall into spontaneous conversation with somebody standing right next to them about something that they just read and how it connected with their own experiences. And this collectively painted a pretty clear picture of what a learning culture could be. So we wanted to start directing the writers. And so we shared a 6-point framework for strong learning in their organization that had been really customized to them and that was really grounded in the field of adult learning. We spent some time reading and discussing some of the scholarship to kind of help people internalize the framework and align to what it meant. Some people are going to be motivated more by the heart. Other people are going to be motivated more by the head. And it felt really important to address both of those sources of motivation for people. And then we practiced applying these ideas, and we had people develop their own tool, like something that they could walk away from that conference with, apply in their daily work to put that framework into action. It was completely customized for their everyday work. So I think from an experiences design perspective, there are a few things that made all of this possible. One, we had longer sessions so that we could go deep when needed. And I know that this goes against the current trend right now to make everything micro. I think that there's a time and a place for that. And I think that as people designing these experiences, we need to be careful not to get carried away by these trends, but again, to ground back in that why are we coming together and what structure is best going to serve that why? This does, of course, require really strong session designers and facilitators. So it's important for event organizers to recognize that, who are your people who are actually going to be filling this time? And do they have the chops to fill it in a way that's going to be really effective for attendees? But there are some things that just aren't possible in 30 or 45-minute chunks. And so I always appreciate programs that have some flexibility built into them to allow the possibility of longer sessions for people who feel like they can design and run them, but also allow some of those kind of shorter, snappier moments as well. I will also say that we had a lot of space to move around and to put people in different configurations, to have private conversations. As a rule of thumb, when I'm evaluating a venue, I always look for at least 3 ways that people can be in conversation with one another. So for example, can they sit at larger tables and then maybe pair up in an open area in the back of the room and maybe also take a walk outside? Is it easy to put people in different configurations? And that's one of the things, we don't always have that option, of course, but it's one of the things that I look for when I'm evaluating a venue. And then finally, I think we have the right people at the table. So this wasn't an open enrollment conference. It was optional, but it also targeted a specific group of people within the organization who were best positioned to act on the shifts that we were trying to bring about. And this reminds me of one of the points that Priya Parker makes in The Art of Gathering, where she says, a good gathering isn't afraid to leave certain people out. And that piece of like, who actually are we bringing into this space, I think is so key to creating powerful dialogue and powerful experiences for people.
Oh my gosh, all of these are such good points. I feel like I should have been writing notes. I do have a little follow-up question about how you gathered the data afterwards to, because when you started this, you mentioned that you received feedback later that they did make the changes that you were looking for. Did you guys do surveys, targeted questionnaires with, the meeting facilitators? Was it like 6 months later, a year later? What are just a couple quick points about how you got that data?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I find that the clearer that I am on the why at the outset, the easier everything else is. Like, the easier it is to find the structure, but also the easier it is to figure out, okay, and what am I going to need to collect after to know whether that why was addressed? And so in this case, because our why had to do with shifts in the learning culture, we had a couple of different places that we needed to look. We did do a survey immediately following the conference, and that gave us some important data about how effective people found the conference itself, which is one thing that we wanted information on. But we had to look a little bit further out to get feedback on whether we were seeing the long-term changes coming out of this conference that we were driving toward. And so some of this came through conversations with team managers within the organization and shifts that they were making themselves, and also in changes that they were seeing within their teams. And then we also looked at some of like the annual employee satisfaction data, for example, that organization collects on an annual basis.
Great, very holistic picture. I love it. How do you determine the need or problem in your planning when you have many attendees?
Yeah, or even worse, when you don't know exactly who they are.
Yeah.
That's happened to me too. I think there are a few places that you can look. So, one, you can always talk to the organizers of the event. Somebody decided that this event should happen. Why? Why is this thing happening? Sometimes I think, especially for events that happen on an ongoing basis, an annual music festival, for example, or a recurring conference for an organization, you can look at some of the history of that event and sort of look at, what's happened in the past and what indications then does that give us about what's next in this event's trajectory over time. And then I think one of the other really interesting places to turn is the broader context of the world at that moment. So I mentioned that I live in the Netherlands. Formula One is huge here. We're getting ready in a couple of weeks for the Dutch Grand Prix, and everybody is going to be descending on Zandvoort, which is really close to where I live. And there's been some really interesting debate here about whether or not drivers should be able to use this event as a platform for speaking out against the war in Ukraine. And it could be that ends up becoming a kind of secondary purpose of this event. I mean, I think if the planners decide, for example, to allow them to fly the Ukrainian flag at the event, they are making that a purpose of the event, to take a stand in some way. I saw a really similar dynamic playing out in the United States around the time of George Floyd's murder, where a common purpose for a lot of events that were happening at that time became, either raising awareness around police brutality or intentionally elevating the voices of BIPOC communities. So, sometimes you have a purpose or a why that comes from the event itself, but sometimes that purpose is part of a longer trajectory, and sometimes it's a direct response to what's happening in the broader world outside of that event.
Yeah, I am loving your responses. I know that you personally are not like a full-time event planner who would ever seek the CMP designation, but so much of your responses, I'm like going back into the EIC textbook. Our listeners will probably be very familiar. There is so much that you're saying that's in like the strategic planning modules. So like you are such a pro. I love it. Okay. The next question is our last one. Let's end with something fun. Share a memory or experience from a super cool event that you've been a part of.
Well, I am the mother of two pretty young children, so I don't get to go to a lot of super cool events these days. But I got to thinking about, where we lived before coming here, which was close to Portland, Oregon, and one of my favorite events that happens there every year, which is the Bridge Pedal. So if you've ever visited Portland, Oregon, you know that the Willamette River runs right through the middle of town. And there are, I think, 11 bridges maybe that cross this river back and forth and cross over each other even throughout the whole Portland metro area. And once a year, they close off quite a few of these bridges, not all of them, because then people would get stranded on either side. And they close them off sort of in intervals too, right? And then you can bike basically back and forth all over the Portland metro area, back and forth across the bridges. And you can bike like over the interstate bridge, which there's no bike path on the interstate bridge in Portland, but it's got this incredible view of downtown. And they've got like bands that have set up there, and they're like playing live music while you bike through, and like it's Portland, so like people are handing out beer as you go. And there's just this incredible sense of community. Portland as a whole is, well, I won't say by Netherlands standards, but by American standards, a pretty bike-friendly city. And there's just something, I think, amazing about seeing thousands of people come out on their bicycles. It's a totally different experience being on your bike than being in a car, because you can interact with your fellow riders in a way that, usually when you interact with other drivers in a car, it's not positive. And there's just something awesome about getting access to these spaces that you can't normally get access, the kind of festival feel of it, being outside, being in your community, that just makes it a really incredible event.
Oh my gosh, that sounds so fun. I didn't know this event existed. I'm going to find myself in Portland next time.
Yeah, I think it's usually in July or August, good time of the year.
All right, great. We'll have a year to plan then. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I have learned so much from you today. For those who want to learn more about you and Mind the Heart, your coaching business, where can they go for more information?
Yeah, so it's first off mine, M-I-N-E, the heart, as in excavating what the treasures of the heart, and pretty straightforward, mindtheheart.com.
Great. All right. Well, thanks to our listeners and Meeting Protocol fans for checking out this episode. Don't forget to go to meetingprotocol.org, where you can sign up for our newsletter that includes links to all of our new podcasts, a CMP tip of the month, as well as tons of resources for all things related to meeting professionals and CMPs.